Chapter 11. An Air Raid on London. One night of brilliant moonlight, I had just come in from a visit to a theatre and was glancing through the evening papers before turning in when my telephone bell rang. On replying, I found the caller was Madame Gabrielle, and in consequence of the cryptic message she gave me, I abandoned the idea of going to bed and remained keenly on the alert. For a full hour, nothing occurred. Then I heard the air raid warnings for which I had been waiting, and soon after the guns, distant at first, but gradually drawing nearer, began to boom out their defiance of the aerial invaders. For nearly 2 hours the raid continued at brief intervals, as squadron after squadron of Gothas came hurtling through the night sky on their mission of hate. As soon as the all-clear signal was given, I hurried out and made my way rapidly to Harrington Street, a quiet thoroughfare at the back of Cadogan Square, with dark, old-fashioned houses, each with the deep basement and flight of steps to the front door, so characteristic of a period of architecture which we may hope has passed away forever. One of these houses was my objective, and I soon found it, for its door was painted in a light shade, quite different from the hue of sombre respectability which characterized all its neighbors in the gloomy street. It was noticeable that while nearly every house in the street showed lights, the inmates had not yet got over their scare and could be heard volubly discussing the alarms and excursions of the night. This particular house was in total darkness and was as silent as the grave. I soon located a deep doorway from which I, myself unseen, could keep a close watch on the dark and silent house, and commenced my vigil. Presently, a man wearing a long, light overcoat turned from the square into Harrington Street, and sauntering leisurely along, ascended the steps of the house I was watching, and let himself in with a latchkey. 5 minutes later, a second man passed close to where I was standing. Luckily, my doorway was in deep shadow, and he did not notice me, and also entered the house. 2 others followed in quick succession. One of them I instantly recognized by his gait. It was blind Heinrich. For 4 hours I kept surveillance, and during that time no fewer than 7 men arrived, each letting himself in with his latchkey. It was evident we had found out the meeting place of some highly doubtful individuals whose obvious familiarity with the locality, coupled with the strange hours at which they arrived, indicated quite clearly that some nefarious scheme was afoot. It was evident, too, that the old Norwegian belonged to the gang, and I began to feel assured that our suspicions as to his real character were well founded. It would have been difficult to find a better place for the meeting, for Harrington Street, though readily accessible, led to nowhere in particular, and was as quiet a thoroughfare as any in London. No one would notice the arrival at intervals of the men, policemen rarely visited the street, and after midnight it was entirely deserted, save for the occasional arrival home of some belated resident. It was not until 5 o'clock in the morning that the last man arrived in a taxi, which, however, did not come along the street, but deposited him at the corner of the square. A quarter of an hour later they began to come out singly, at intervals of about 5 minutes, dispersing in different directions. There was no sign, however, of Heinrich Christensen. "Well, mon cher Gerald," said Madame Gabrielle, as she sat with me in my flat in Curzon Street soon after breakfast the same morning. "You see, they receive warning of coming air raids and meet directly after. Who are they?" "Enemy spies, beyond any possibility of doubt," I replied. "Our course is clear now. When the next raid is made, we must follow them individually and learn each man's identity. I will make all the arrangements. Meanwhile, do you continue as you are and keep an eye on the blind fiddler." Madame Gabrielle returned to Hereford Road to continue her watch. For my own part, I set to work and very soon discovered that the mysterious house in Harrington Street was unoccupied and was to let furnished. In the guise of a possible tenant, I went over it thoroughly, but could see nothing suspicious, except that I ascertained that the caretaker was an old compatriot of Heinrich's. The owner, who had left London and was now residing on the south coast, was well known, and his loyalty was beyond dispute. It then became evident that the caretaker was cognizant of the secret meeting, if, indeed, he was not closely concerned in the business, whatever it might be, that brought these men together in an empty house at dead of night, so soon after a raid, when most honest people would be only too anxious to get to bed as promptly as possible. It was obviously necessary that we should learn all we could about the identity of the men who met in the empty house in Harrington Street, and I was soon in touch with the special branch and made all the necessary arrangements for shadowing our suspects. 4 nights later, another raid took place. As soon as the Gothas were gone, we were all swiftly at our posts. So thoroughly was the house surrounded that a mouse could hardly have gone in or out undetected. Yet there was no sign of a watcher, and anyone going to the house would certainly be in blissful ignorance of the fact that he was under the close scrutiny of the keen eyes of the Secret Service. There is very little clumsy shadowing about the special branch, but we watched in vain. No meeting was held, or if it was held elsewhere. The blind musician, it is true, left his room in Bayswater, but he never reached Harrington Street. The house remained all night silent and apparently deserted. I wondered whether the gang had by any chance discovered our activities and taken alarm. I was not very deeply concerned about it, apart from the chagrin which the delay caused me. Blind Heinrich, at any rate, could hardly escape us, and, if the gang had for any reason changed its place of meeting, I had little doubt that we should soon discover it. But who had blundered? I felt certain that it was not Madame Gabrielle, and I did not think it could be myself. One morning I received a note from the clever little Frenchwoman asking me to take tea with her at Hereford Road that afternoon, and adding, "I have something to show you." Of course I went, and we had tea together in the big drawing-room which she used in common with the other guests in the boarding-house. Several of the old ladies who lived in the house were present. Just as we had finished our tea, Madame exclaimed, "Do excuse me, monsieur. I have forgotten my handkerchief." Rising, she left me. When she returned, she was carrying a work-bag of blue brocaded silk, which she placed upon her lap as she reseated herself. In her hand, also, she had an evening paper, which she handed to me with a casual remark that I might like to look at it while she got her work ready. I knew well enough that this was for the benefit of the other people in the room, who, as usual, were keenly interested in any friends of a pretty woman and were scrutinizing me pretty carefully. I knew, too, that Gabrielle had some further motive in her mind. Accordingly, I leaned back in my chair and read the paper diligently. A moment later, I noticed Madame Gabrielle telegraphing me in our finger Morse. "Look carefully at the book showing in the mouth of my work bag," she signaled, "and get a copy at once. It belongs to Heinrich, and I have just borrowed it from his room. He may be back at any moment. He has only just gone out, and I must replace it at once." She had casually left the mouth of her work-bag open. It revealed the title page of an open book, published, as I saw, about 7 years before. The title was Royal Love Letters. I had never heard of the volume, but I made a note of its title. Madame Gabrielle, with an excuse, quitted the room for a few moments, taking the book with her in her bag. On her return, she began talking pleasantly about general subjects, but she was listening keenly, I could see. Soon we heard the front door slam, and a heavy shuffling tread crossed the hall and went up the stairs. "Blind Heinrich," she telegraphed. "I was only just in time. He is terribly watchful, and would certainly have noticed if the book had not been on the table where he left it. I often wonder whether he is as blind as he pretends to be. You had better go. If he comes in here for tea, it is quite possible he may recognize you." A quarter of an hour later, we were walking along Westbourne Grove together, and Gabrielle told me the history of the mysterious book. For several days, she said, she had been following Heinrich, who had suddenly developed an amazing interest in second-hand bookstalls. He had gone into shop after shop in various parts of London, asked a single question apparently, and come out again. At length, she had managed to overhear him ask at one shop for a copy of Royal Love Letters. The shopkeeper had not the volume in stock, and as the request was such a peculiar one for a man of Heinrich's temperament, Madame Gabrielle determined to run risks and follow him daily. He entered 6 more shops, making the same request at each, and at length, in a dingy little by-lane in Soho, managed, to his evident glee, to get what he wanted, and carried it back to Hereford Road with obvious satisfaction. "Why that particular book, and why so much trouble to get it?" said Madame Gabrielle. "What do you make of it, Mr. SANT?" I made nothing of it, except that there seemed to be good reasons why I should get a copy at once. If royal love letters interested Heinrich Christensen so deeply, it might well be that it would not be wholly without interest for me. My first care was to ring up Heck on the official telephone and give him full particulars respecting Heinrich's sudden interest in an obscure and practically unknown volume published and forgotten 7 years ago. It was quite clear that this was a hint we could not ignore, but I confess I failed to see how it helped us. But I was soon to learn more. Heck's quick brain had seen a possibility which I had overlooked. At 7 next morning, before I was out of bed, my telephone rang, and Heck once more spoke to me. "I have been searching the papers, SANT," he said, "and I have found out something that will interest you. Listen carefully. In the Petit Parisien, 5 days ago, there was an advertisement for the recovery of a lady's gold trinket. I have it here. I'll read it to you." And he read, "Perdus ou trouvé. Perdu mais. Opéra breloque. Or. Vialet. 28. Marigny. Air. 100. "Yes," I said. "I hear you. But what has that to do with me?" "Listen," said Heck. "There is nobody named Violette at that address. We found that out at once. I have had nearly 50 of my people examining every advertisement in the Paris papers issued just before Heinrich began to display an interest in royal love letters. Now we have found out that the advertisement I have just read to you conveys in cryptogrammic form the message, 'Buy royal love letters.' It would take too long to explain it, but the paper containing that advertisement would be on sale in London the very day on which, according to Madame Gabrielle, Heinrich began to haunt the second-hand bookstalls on his peculiar quest. Rather curious, is it not?" Curious it certainly was, and once more I found myself confronted with a further enigma. Why on earth should the book be advertised in cryptogrammic form in a French newspaper? How did Heinrich come to see the advertisement, and how did he know the key to the code? No doubt the paper had accepted the innocent-looking advertisement without the slightest suspicion that it was anything but the genuine announcement it purported to be. It was impossible to overlook the coincidence between the appearance of the advertisement and blind Heinrich's sudden deep interest in a forgotten book. Next day I started out in search of a copy of Royal Love Letters. Of course I failed to get one. It had been out of print for years, as it had been published privately, and comparatively few copies had been printed. However, I sent wires to some 20 provincial dealers in second-hand books, and at noon next day had a reply from a dealer in Birmingham offering me a copy for 4 and 6pence. I wired the money, and next morning received the shabby little volume. Little did I realize what a dividend my investment of 4 shillings and 6pence was going to pay me. On reading the book through, I found it was merely a monograph on the published love letters of various royal personages. It was as dull as the proverbial ditch water, and I was not surprised at the difficulty both Heinrich and myself had experienced in securing copies. The wonder was that any had escaped the fire or the waste paper basket, but the very fact made Heinrich's interest in the book the more suspicious. It conveyed nothing to me, it is true, about Gotha raids on London, but did it convey anything to Heinrich, or was it the means of conveying anything from him to someone else? I called up Madame Gabrielle on the phone, and after she had arrived and examined the volume, we went out to lunch at the Ritz. Across the table, I told her of the curious advertisement in the Petit Parisien, whereupon she exclaimed, "Why, Christensen reads that paper regularly. I often see him with it. He goes down practically every column of it with his big reading glass." "That settles 2 points anyhow," I said. "The first is that he uses that paper for receiving and perhaps for sending messages. The second is that he knows the spy cipher used in drawing up the advertisement. I am beginning to feel that this out-of-print and forgotten book will, if we watch carefully, supply us with a very interesting line to follow." And, ringing up Heck, I told him about the latest development. He was keenly alive to the possibilities of the new situation. Chapter 12. The Secret of the Ribbon. Our new discovery seemed to me so remarkable that I lost no time in impressing upon Madame Gabrielle the imperative necessity of the closest possible scrutiny of blind Heinrich's actions. I was more than anxious that we should not lose sight of him for an instant, and that I should be kept fully informed of his every action. For by this time I was firmly convinced that, through some medium which we had yet to discover, he was in some way keeping up communication with the more active agents of the enemy. And if we could but discover the channel through which the stream of communications flowed, it would not be long, I felt sure, before we had the key to the mystery in our hands. Suddenly, and without any obvious reason, Heinrich completely changed his habits. Hitherto always on the move, he took to remaining indoors all day, hardly ever going out except for a short stroll in the evening. He met no one, and apparently spoke scarcely a word to anybody. What his numerous pupils thought of his sudden neglect of them I cannot say, but it was clear enough that something important must have occurred to induce him thus suddenly to abandon what was, professedly at any rate, his sole means of livelihood. I was discussing him, he was almost invariably our sole topic of conversation nowadays, with Madame Gabrielle as she sat in my room one morning. I cannot conceive of any reason, I said, why Heinrich should have so suddenly changed the entire routine of his existence. It looks to me as though either something very important has happened or that he is expecting important news. Yet he receives no messages. He never gets even a letter or a telegram. There is only one fact that is peculiar, said the smart Frenchwoman. You know I have been looking after him pretty closely lately. Well, whenever he goes out, though he appears to wander about quite aimlessly, he invariably contrives his walk so that it takes him through Lembridge Square. He never misses. Does he always go the same side of the square? I asked. She replied in the affirmative, and I decided to have a look round the square for myself at once. That same afternoon found me on the scene of blind Heinrich's daily walk. The square itself varied little from hundreds of others in London. It showed every evidence of dreary respectability common to half the squares in London. Two things, however, attracted my notice. In the ground floor window of one house was a big brass cage containing a grey parrot, which was insistently emitting the hideous noises common to the parrot tribe. In a similar window, about a dozen houses away, was a case containing some old-fashioned wax flowers beneath a glass dome, evidently a survival from the ornamental style peculiar to the early Victorian epoch to which, indeed, the whole dreary square seemed to belong. There was nothing to offer a lucid explanation of why blind Heinrich should choose such a path for his daily ramble. There were dozens of other far more attractive promenades within easy walking distance. Yet here, unless my instinct entirely misled me, was the solution to our riddle. Day after day I followed the old fellow's route. I even went so far as to shadow Heinrich himself more than once, and verified Madame Gabrielle's observation. No matter which way he started out, he never failed, on either the outward or homeward journey, to pass along that particular side of the square. Yet he never spoke to anyone, and I was morally certain that no signal was ever made to him from any of the houses. On the fourth day I noticed a slight fact. The ring on the top of the parrot's cage was tied with a big bow of yellow ribbon. 3 days later it was altered to dark blue. On the 8th day it had returned to yellow again. Why these changes? Were they signals? That night, enemy aircraft crossed the southeast coast, but their attempts to reach London were defeated by the terrific fire of the anti-aircraft guns and by a swift concentration of our fighting aeroplanes, which broke up several successive squadrons and sent the raiders hurrying home again. Several of my capable assistants then took over the task of finding out all that was known regarding the house in Lembridge Square. 48 hours later, I had a full report. I learned that the man in whose room the parrot lived was one of the mysterious band who foregathered to meet Christenston in the empty house in Harrington Street. He was then dressed as a special constable, a part which, by the way, he had no right whatever to play. He bore the thoroughly English name of Mostyn Brown and was in business in the city as the agent of a Manchester firm of cotton merchants. Apart from the fact of his presence that night in Harrington Street, nothing that the most exhaustive inquiries revealed suggested in the smallest degree any association with agents of the enemy. To all appearances, he was a perfectly respectable city man, in no way different from thousands of others. But there was a very big but. What was his business in the dead of night in an empty house in the West End in company of a suspected German spy? A few days later, the men who were keeping the houses in Lembridge Square and Hereford Road under surveillance sent me a strange report which set me thinking deeply. By some means, whether he suspected he was being watched or whether a lucky chance favoured him, we never knew. Blind Heinrich managed to elude the unwearying vigilance of Madame Gabrielle and arrived alone, evidently in a hurry, at Westbourne Grove. Here he hailed a taxi and was driven to Waterloo Station. There at the booking office on the Loop Line side, he had met a short, fat man, to whom, after a brief conversation, he handed a bottle wrapped in white paper. They remained in conversation a few minutes longer and then parted. The fat man was followed to the Tube Railway and thence to King's Cross, where he had bought a ticket for Peterborough and left by the 5:30 express. Why Peterborough? I wondered. There were certainly no facilities there for anyone engaged in Germany's nefarious work, but attached to the report was a snapshot, taken secretly, of course, which showed me at once that the little fat man was apparently a sailor, camouflaged, hastily, in a badly fitting overcoat and a cloth cap. That gave me a further clue. I took down a Bradshaw, and glancing at the train by which the little fat man had travelled, made an interesting discovery. It was the Newcastle Express. I began to see why the mysterious little man had booked to Peterborough. That afternoon, I ascertained that the parrot's cage in the house in Lembridge Square sported a broad ribbon of yellow satin. At midnight, I rang up Heck at his house at Saint-Germain and asked him to send Aubert the detective over at once. An hour after midnight came another air raid alarm, the second to coincide with the appearance of the yellow ribbon. Now, one coincidence of this kind may mean nothing. Two begin to be suspicious. A third is convincing. I found my suspicions deepening into certainty. Directly the air raid warning was given, our watchers in Harrington Street were keenly on the alert, but, though they watched all night, there was no meeting of the mysterious men in the empty house. I guessed the reason. The raiders were again driven back before they could reach the metropolis, and, therefore, there was no news to be gathered for transmission to the authorities in Berlin. Everything now pointed with increasing certainty to the house in Lembridge Square as a focus of enemy activity. Directly the all-clear had been sounded over the London area, Heinrich left Hereford Road and, according to Madame Gabrielle's report to me, hurried round to the house of the Grey Parrot. He remained there about half an hour, and then retraced his steps home in the waning moonlight. Thus mystery followed mystery. What was the meaning of the various coloured bows on the parrot's cage? For that, they had a very definite meaning I no longer doubted. It seemed, indeed, tolerably clear that the yellow ribbon betokened a coming raid, and evidently the half-blind old musician was a close friend of the manufacturer's agent. But who, in reality, was the mysterious Most in Brown, and, if he were indeed an enemy agent, how had he managed to elude the close watch that had been set upon him? It had struck me that the house which sheltered the Grey Parrot might conceivably conceal a wireless plant of sufficient power to convey a message to a submarine lurking off the coast. Such a plant need not be a conspicuous affair, but one of my agents, posing as an official of the Metropolitan Water Board, had been able to negative the suggestion, and I confess I found myself still hopelessly puzzled as to the means by which information of the damage done by the raiding aircraft was so speedily and so accurately conveyed to the enemy. By this time, Aubert had arrived from Paris and had taken an obscure lodging in Chessington Street, a dingy thoroughfare off the Euston Road. By appointment, I met him late one night at the corner of Gray's Inn Road and Holborn, and, having explained to him briefly what had occurred, told him to hold himself in readiness for instant action. The apparent abandonment of the secret meetings in Harrington Street was a source of considerable anxiety and chagrin. I was particularly anxious about them. We had several of those who had taken part in the first meeting under close observation, but had learned nothing about them sufficient to justify our taking strong action. Most of them, indeed, seemed to be of the same apparently blameless type as Mr. Mostyn Brown, and it was evident that if they were indeed enemy agents, they had been selected or appointed by a master hand at the game of espionage, and I wanted badly to gain some more information about them. Madame Gabrielle was ever on the alert, and soon it appeared from her report that the blind fiddler was expecting another raid. The ribbon bow on the parrot's cage changed to dark blue and remained so for 6 days. On the 7th, it was replaced by yellow. That night the old man remained in his room, reading for hours after all the other inmates had retired. But that night no raid was made. I now began to think that it would be well if I took the mysterious Mostyn Brown under my own special observation. For a week during the moonless nights I shadowed him closely. I found out that he was a member of a certain third-class city club, frequented by a large number of pure-blooded Englishmen who happened to bear German names. Of course, they had been naturalized, and very soon my name appeared on the club books. It was not long before I managed to scrape acquaintance with Mostyn Brown over a game of billiards. I cultivated his friendship eagerly, and very soon we were on excellent terms. As a matter of fact, I wanted an invitation to his house, and at last I got it. I spent there one of the dullest evenings of my life, an evening, as it happened, entirely wasted. Beyond noting that the ribbon on the parrot's cage had again turned to blue, I saw nothing of the slightest interest. The next night, however, I made a discovery. Dropping in at the club, I found Mostyn Brown engaged in a game of billiards with a man whom I knew in the club as Harry Smith, a bullet-headed, bespectacled person with hair standing erect as the bristles of a blacking brush. Smith looked the typical Hun, and I very soon decided in my own mind that Heinrich Schmidt was probably the name by which he was first known to the world. Suddenly a dispute arose about some point in the game, and in a moment words were running high. Half a dozen spectators noisily joined in the altercation, and the room was a babel of dispute. I saw my chance. Taking Mostyn Brown's side, I suddenly interjected a sentence in German. Apparently hardly noticing the change in his excitement, Mostyn Brown replied in the same language, and his accent told me at once that he was not of British birth. There was no possibility of mistake, for however well the Hun may speak our tongue, he will inevitably betray himself when in a moment of excitement he lapses into his own language. My suspicions of Mostyn Brown were naturally intensified 100-fold by this discovery. Of course, I redoubled my efforts, and was in daily conference with certain highly placed people in Whitehall, whose curiosity was now fully roused, as well as with my own agents, the vivacious Madame Gabrielle and the slow but painstaking and relentless Aubert. The watch on the suspects became closer than ever, and I was convinced that, try how he might, none of them could move, practically speaking, without full details of what he was doing reaching me in the course of an hour or two at most. And I was ready to strike hard at the earliest moment when decisive action might seem justified. For the moment, however, there was nothing to be done but watch and wait, tense and expectant, while night by night the moon drew nearer and nearer to the full. Thanks to the information I was able to place before the authorities in Whitehall, there was little chance of the anti-aircraft defences of London being caught napping, while the secret signal I had discovered, the changing of the coloured ribbon on the parrot's cage at Mostyn Brown's house in Lembridge Square, would be almost certain to give us warning of any long-arranged raid in force. Apart from the sequel, the worst we had to expect was a sudden dash by a few machines in the event of an unexpected improvement in the weather rendering such a course possible. But with regard to the big raids, involving days of patient preparation, settled weather, and most careful and thorough organization, we felt tolerably sure that the telltale ribbon would give us the warning we wanted. So it proved in the event, and once again the Hun's trickiness brought his carefully planned scheme to failure. Chapter 13. How Berlin Obtains Information. At last, the day, or rather the night, which we had been expecting came. The sun had risen in a cloudless sky, and all day long had poured down a fierce flood of heat and light. London was stifling. Everyone seemed to be the victim of heat lassitude. Tempers were decidedly short, and even the most amiable of people seemed suddenly to have developed raw-edged nerves. Added to all this was an uneasy presentiment of danger. "There will be a big raid tonight," was the thought in the back of everyone's mind. In order to avoid arousing Mostyn Brown's suspicions that his house was being watched, we had given up, apparently, all observation on the place during daylight. But not in reality. In a house on the other side of the square, directly facing that occupied by Mostyn Brown, I had hired a room on the third floor, and from the window, with the help of powerful field glasses, we could keep the house under the strictest watch. We had not even to enter the square to reach our tower of vantage, for there was a back entrance from an adjoining street. Towards this eyrie I had bent my steps, and on arriving I found Aubert in a state of suppressed excitement. "Look," he said, handing me the glasses, and, taking them from him, I levelled them at Mostyn Brown's room. The ribbon on the parrot's cage had been changed to yellow, but this was not all. The sun shone full on the window of Mostyn Brown's house, and his room was strongly illuminated. The field glasses showed us that Mostyn Brown was at home, a most unusual thing in the daytime, and that with him was blind Heinrich. How Heinrich had got there we could not imagine. Aubert had not seen him enter. They were seated on chairs drawn up to the table and were poring intently over a book, apparently making memoranda on sheets of paper. As we watched, Madame Gabrielle, habited as a coster girl and carrying a huge basket of flowers, came slowly along the square, past Mostyn Brown's house, and round past the house in which we were seated. I saw her flutter a signal, and, with her arm resting naturally on the side of the basket, she rapidly tapped out a message with her nimble fingers. "Heinrich has been with Mostyn Brown for the past 2 hours," she spelt out. "He came straight from Hereford Road and went into the next house from the back." Evidently there was some way of communication at the rear of the two houses. I had now no time to waste, and leaving Aubert and Madame Gabrielle to keep the necessary watch, I hurried off to Whitehall, where I was soon in deep talk with the astute and enterprising chief of the London defences, a keen officer who by sheer merit had forced himself to the very front rank in aircraft service. "Good," he said, when I had told him my news. "I think we shall give them a surprise tonight. Perhaps you would like to see how we work. Sit down for a bit." And he turned to his big table on which stood a telephone. For the next half-hour I watched him, fascinated with his sure grasp of London's intricate defences, and amazed, though I had thought I knew his capability, at the swiftness and decision with which he issued what to me seemed a veritable jumble of orders. To centre after centre of the aircraft defences, he spoke a series of numbers, so bewildering in their speed and complexity that an enemy agent seated in the very room could not have gained a scrap of information. Even to me, familiar as I am with almost every branch of code work, it was a veritable revelation. "I think we are ready for them now," he said finally, wiping the perspiration from his face, and I could see that even to him the strain had been severe. How well he had done his work all England was to know the next day, though the public never even suspected the magnitude of his task. There was now nothing to do but wait. Our traps were set, and it remained to be seen whether the enemy would walk into them. I made my way to my chambers for a few hours' rest, and was soon deeply asleep. At 9:30, Burton, my man, roused me. "The first warning has just come in," he said. I dressed swiftly and sat down to snatch a hasty supper, knowing well that it might be many hours before I tasted another meal. It was exactly 10 o'clock when the report of the first maroon broke the stillness, and London, with one accord, hastened to cover. 10 minutes later the streets were deserted, and a midnight hush reigned supreme. The great city seemed a city of the dead. As we listened, a faint, distant boom struck softly on our ears. The strafe had begun. Suddenly, far away to the eastward, a searchlight flickered up into the sky. Another and another followed in rapid succession, and soon the entire sky was covered and checkered by dozens of wavering pillars of flame, moving to and fro, methodically searching the heavens as though moved by a single hand. Far above us, I caught the soft purr of an aeroplane, evidently one of our own, for the sound was quite different from the deeper and rougher note of the Gothas. Suddenly, with a deafening crash, half a dozen guns barked simultaneously, and looking out, I saw far away, seemingly caught on a pencil of living light, the ethereal butterfly shape of an enemy aircraft. A second later, in quick succession, came the unmistakable sound of bursting bombs. In the midst of the tumult, a single tiny light showed for a moment far up in the sky, just outside the ring of shrapnel that was bursting all round the enemy craft, now hopelessly entangled in the beams of a dozen converging searchlights, and, dive and drop as it would, utterly unable to escape from the zone of effulgent radiance in which it seemed to float. Instantly, every gun was silent. We caught the crackle of a machine gun far up in the air, and a moment later the enemy machine burst into a lurid sheet of flame, and the blazing mass pitched headlong to earth amid a roar of cheering from watchers who in thousands had braved all possible danger to see the aerial fight heralded by the outburst of machine gun fire. It was obvious that one of our Sentinel aeroplanes, perched far above the raider, had caught sight of him in the searchlights and, swooping swift as a hawk on his quarry, had sent the Gotha a fiery run to the earth 12,000 feet below. I learned later that the Gotha had fallen in Essex, the three occupants calcined to cinders in the flood of blazing petrol. That was the extent of London's excitement for the night. It was not until some hours later that I learnt that no fewer than 8 squadrons of Gothas, each consisting of 4 machines, had started out on their errand of murder for London. Only a single machine got through, and that now lay a heap of ruins. The rest had been split up by gunfire, caught in the beams of endless searchlights, harried to and fro by a vast concentration of British fighting planes swiftly assembled when the warning of the yellow ribbon had become known, and had been relentlessly chased homeward in utter disorder. Their repulse was a triumph brought about by Colonel's masterly effort at organization, when I conveyed to him in Whitehall the news which had reached me through a simple yellow ribbon tied to a grey parrot's cage. Reports soon began to reach me in swift succession from my subordinates in many quarters. Hereford Road, Harrington Street, and Lembridge Square were being carefully watched. Madame Gabrielle and Aubert, the latter dressed in the guise of a seafarer, were on the alert, with dozens of other reliable agents ready for anything at a moment's notice. Suddenly, Aubert rang me up on the phone. I took up the receiver and spoke to him for a few moments. "Meet me at the corner of Harrington Street at 5 o'clock, I said. We met in the grey light of dawn, and I soon learned that with anything like reasonable good fortune, we had in our hands the opportunity for a great coup. Blind Heinrich had gone to the house soon after the all clear had been sounded. He had been followed by Mostyn Brown, again in the uniform of a special constable, and by 5 other men, one of whom was the little fat man who had previously met Christensen at Waterloo. Now I had made up my mind that the little fat man was the intermediary by whom the news collected by the other conspirators was conveyed abroad, and it was essential that he should be caught red-handed. Fortune had favoured us. He had been the first to leave the house, had walked to the Queen's Road Underground station, and, as we learnt by telephone, had travelled to King's Cross. Here he was at present, seated in one of the waiting rooms, evidently intending to travel by an early train. Leaving the necessary instructions with regard to the conspirators still in the house in Harrington Street, I accompanied Aubert to King's Cross. The little fat man was still there, but just after 7 he walked to the booking office and took a ticket for Peterborough. Just behind him in the queue of passengers were Aubert and myself. When the express pulled out on its fast run to Peterborough, the first stopping place, Aubert sat in the same carriage as the little fat man, apparently profoundly asleep. I was in the next compartment, ready for anything that might happen. We were not much surprised when at Peterborough the little fat man remained in the train, and so we continued our journey. When tickets were examined, the little man paid excess fare to Newcastle, and my hopes of an important capture rose momentarily higher. Hour after hour the express raced northward, and in the afternoon we came to smoky Newcastle, where we were to be the witnesses of a strange denouement. The little fat man, closely followed by Aubert and myself, made straight for the docks. Here, in haste, he boarded a steamer, one of a service which sailed regularly between Newcastle and Bergen. He was evidently known, for he was greeted without question by the men about the decks and promptly disappeared below. We followed with several other passengers, and very soon I sat in the captain's cabin, swiftly explaining to the owner what had happened, and my suspicion of the man who had just come on board with a freedom of movement which suggested that he was one of the crew. Captain Jackson was one of the men who have done so much to make the North Sea Service a model of everything that is implied in unswerving courage and loyal devotion to duty. A fine, bluff, grey-bearded skipper of the very best type, he cared not a rap for the peril of mines and submarines, which dogged him at every yard of his journeys. All he cared for or respected was the Admiralty orders which gave him his chart through the ever-shifting minefields. With those in his crew, he was ready to take his ship across to Norway and to defy the Huns to do their worst. His face grew grave and iron-stern as he heard my story, and, loyal Englishman as he was, he instantly fell in with my suggestion for trapping the scoundrel who was bringing disgrace on the good name of all sailors by his infamous traffic with the agents of the enemy. "George Humber is the name he goes by," said Captain Jackson, referring to the man we had followed from Lembridge Square. "He says he is a Swede and has Swedish papers. Let your French friend go below and help. I'll see to it." He called up the chief engineer, Andrew Fail, a dour, hard, bitter Scotchman who had followed the sea for 40 years and cared for nothing on earth but it and his beloved engines. If ever a man loved his machines, it was Fail, and if ever a man was loved and trusted by his subordinates, it was he. Hard though he was, his crew, with the sure instinct of the sailor, recognized his sterling qualities and would have followed his lead through the worst storm that ever blew. Indeed, the Prot was emphatically what is known among sailormen as a happy ship, thanks to the captain and chief engineer, and I was not altogether surprised to learn that Humber was the only discordant note among the crew. For some reason the men disliked him, though he did his work well enough. An hour later, having taken our mails on board, we dropped down the Tyne bound for Norway. I learned from Captain Jackson that Humber had signed on some months before and had made a number of trips across the North Sea. He had been in the habit of travelling to London each time the vessel reached Newcastle, and at length this fact had aroused Captain Jackson's suspicions, and he had made up his mind that this trip should be Humber's last. It was, indeed, but the end came in a manner which not even Captain Jackson's keen wits had anticipated. In the meantime, I knew that Aubert, a splendid linguist, who could play many parts, from that of an idler in Paris to a worker in a munition factory, was somewhere below in the engine-room, certainly not very far from Humber, and assuredly very much on the alert. An hour after we left the Tyne mouth, I was standing with some of the passengers on deck, watching some winking signals as our convoy appeared out of the misty twilight. Of what the convoy consisted, I could not quite discern, but the captain, before he ascended to his bridge, had said, "Our friends will pick us up presently, and they will see us safely across and look out for submarines." The night passed without incident, and the next day proved grey and windy. Ever and anon, one of our patrolling airships paid us a visit, while 3 other ships, forming our convoy, stood by, with their deadly guns ever ready to talk in deadly earnest with any submarine that might venture to show her periscope. At 10 o'clock that night, I was on deck watching a series of strange flashes of light showing in the eastern sky, when a sailor approached and informed me that the captain wanted to see me in his cabin. I went at once. "Look here, Mr. Sant," the bluff old seaman exclaimed as soon as I had closed the door, which he locked. "I've been rummaging the ship. Does this interest you?" And he brought out from the drawer in his table a bottle of medicine. It had apparently been recently bought from a chemist, for it was wrapped up in the usual paper, which was still quite clean and fresh, and sealed in the usual way. "This was found by your French friend concealed in Humber's trunk. Your man would be up here, only he is watching the fellow below, and as he is supposed to be on duty, his absence might rouse suspicions." As Captain Jackson ended, he handed me the bottle. It does interest me indeed, I said. If Humber were ill enough to need medicine, and he certainly does not look it, he would hardly have brought this all the way from London without opening it. And I thought of the bottle wrapped in white paper, which on an earlier visit to London Humber had received from blind Heinrich at Waterloo. I'll have a look at it anyhow, I said. My first precaution was to soften the sealing wax with a match so that I could unwrap the bottle without tearing the paper, and, if necessary, so replace it that no suspicion that it had been tampered with should be aroused. The bottle might prove useless as a clue. In that case, we should have to seek further, and to replace the bottle in Humber's trunk in such a condition that he must inevitably see that it had been opened would certainly arouse his suspicions and defeat our object. I soon had the paper opened out. The bottle of medicine seemed genuine enough. It bore the label of a well-known West End firm and the name of Mr. Humber. I tasted the contents. Cough mixture, was my comment, and Captain Jackson at once confirmed me. Humber never had a cough, he remarked reflectively. Now for the paper, I said, and began examining it. It was perfectly blank, and I was experiencing a pang of disappointment when, catching on the paper the reflection of the swinging lamp, I detected in one corner a faint, glistening line. Lemon juice, I was confident. Under appropriate treatment, a number of neat figures arranged in groups of 3 sprang into vivid prominence on the inside of the paper wrapping. They ran 1, 2, 3, -5, -8, 2, 7-3, 2, -6, 4, 6-2, 3-11. 294-12-3, 18-1-8, and so on. I swiftly copied out the figures for safety and handed the original paper to Captain Jackson, who, on board his own ship, was, of course, the supreme and unquestioned authority, and I wanted his full approval and support to any action that might be necessary. The figures were meaningless as they stood, but I had not forgotten old Heinrich's systematic search for that odd volume of royal love letters. I had my copy in my bag and fetched it at once. With such an obscure book as the key to the cipher, there was no need for any further elaborate precautions, and we hit upon the solution of the difficulty at once. On page 123, the 8th letter on the 5th line was B. On page 27, the 6th letter in the 32nd line was R. And in a few minutes, I had decoded the word Brixton. Going on, I found that the message conveyed the news that number 24, Road, Brixton, had been wrecked by one of the bombs dropped in the recent raid, that a man, a woman, and 2 children had been killed. The spots where the other bombs had fallen were accurately described, and it was stated that they had done no damage beyond blowing holes in the roads and bursting gas and water mains. Every word was accurate. And the key to the whole problem was the mysterious advertisement for a lost trinket in the Petit Parisien. That simple advertisement, so apparently innocent, had announced to blind Heinrich the enemy's change of code. And without the book to which it referred, no intelligence on earth could have deciphered the disorderly mass of figures which lay before our eyes. "Well, I think we have got them now, Captain," I said, "and I am sure the government will be deeply obliged to you for your assistance. But how am I going to get this fellow? If he lands in Norway, he will be out of our power." "Come on deck," said Captain Jackson with a laugh. "Don't make your mind uneasy about that." I followed him up the companionway ladder to the deck, now deserted by all save the steersman and the officer on watch. "Come up to the bridge with me," said the captain. Although it was so near the period of full moon, the night was dark, the sky being covered by a dense mass of heavy clouds. Try as we would, our eyes could not pierce the gloom, and we could see nothing a few yards from the ship. Though we had parted company from the destroyers long before, we were, of course, travelling without lights in view of possible danger, and only the binnacle lamp shed a soft radiance on the ship's compass. I was soon to learn, however, how closely we were watched. Captain Jackson entered the wheelhouse and touched a key. From the masthead above, a signal lamp flashed intermittently for a few seconds. Instantly from the southward winked an answering gleam, and Captain Jackson turned to me. "That's a destroyer," he said. and she is coming up full speed." For the next few minutes, signals were exchanged with the racing destroyer, which was on our track, and soon I caught sight of the faint glow from her funnels, and then the outline of her low, rakish hull as she came abreast with us. At a signal from Captain Jackson, our engines stopped, and soon we were lying motionless, while a boat from the destroyer pulled rapidly across the gap which separated the two vessels. A few minutes later, a smart naval officer came on board with 4 men. We were soon seated in the captain's cabin, and I rapidly gave him an outline of what had happened. His quick intelligence took in the situation at a glance. "I'll take your Mr. Humber back with me," he said, "and you and your man can come along." But we were nearly to lose our man. As the officer and his men entered the engine room, Humber caught sight of them. He started, but instantly recovered himself. As the lieutenant spoke to Fail, Humber watched him closely. I saw Obey move noiselessly but swiftly behind Humber, evidently ready for a tussle. A moment later, File beckoned Humber to come to him. Instantly, the spy's hand shot to his jacket pocket, and, as it came out, bringing with it a revolver, Aubert sprang. The next instant, the revolver was on the floor, and Aubert had Humber in a grip of iron. 10 minutes later, with Humber securely handcuffed, we were on our way to the destroyer, and were soon thrashing our way at top speed for home. There is little more to tell. Humber proved to be a Swede named Holmboe, and we clearly established the fact that he had been for a long time acting as the traveling agent of the Berlin Espionage Bureau, carrying information to Norway for transmission through the German legation in Christiania. The conspirators in the house in Harrington Street were all taken into custody, and we soon had all the threads of their activities in our possession, including the key to the mystery of Mr. Mostyn Brown, whose connection with various little affairs of espionage was clearly established. Blind Heinrich, too, was at length effectively unmasked, and, with the rest of the group, is now safely under lock and key, with ample leisure to repent of the nefarious business upon which they were engaged. On this occasion, at any rate, the secret message failed to reach Berlin, and I often laugh when I think of the amazement and anxiety that must have been caused in the enemy's camp at the sudden silence of their emissaries. Today we can afford to make them a present of the truth. Chapter 14. The Great Submarine Plot. To be a success as a secret agent, a wide knowledge of European hotels is an absolute necessity. You must, indeed, be familiar with the best hotel in every city of any importance, and scarcely less important is the personal acquaintance of the manager, for without his help you will inevitably find in your path 1,000 difficulties, small and great, which, with his friendly assistance, melt almost insensibly away. Duty and inclination alike have led me to make a special study of hotel life, and I think I may say, without undue egotism, that there are few maîtres d'hôtel in Europe with whom I am not on terms of acquaintance, and even in many cases warm friendship. I was especially fortunate in this respect in the situation in which I found myself one sunny morning in June 1917. As the clock struck 10, I strolled out of a big hotel, which I will call the Waldesruhe in Lucerne, and wandered along the shady avenue beside the lake in the direction of the Schwanenplatz. Luigi Battini, the manager of the Waldesruhe, was one of my closest personal friends, and I should have stayed at the Waldesruhe at any time I was in Lucerne, quite apart from the particular business which had brought me there on this occasion. Luigi was one of those marvelously efficient human machines which appear almost to reach omniscience in everything connected, even remotely, with his profession. He would give his guests, offhand and without the slightest hesitation, minutely detailed directions for the most complicated of journeys without opening a timetable, and invariably his information was correct to the smallest particular. He knew at what stations every dining car was put on every train within a radius of hundreds of miles, and he impressed upon you, in the far-off pre-war days, to remember that the train left Weiss for Passau 20 minutes earlier this month than the hour mentioned in the timetable. His memory, especially for faces, was prodigious. Indeed, it was to this that I owed the beginnings of our friendship. Years before, Luigi had been a waiter at the Great Buffet at Liverpool, where passengers from the incoming American boats were in the habit of snatching a hasty meal before joining the train for London. I had arrived in England from New York, cold and hungry, and, owing to some delay about my baggage, was unable to get to the restaurant until just before the London Express was due to start. I had not realized how long I had been delayed, and had just taken my first mouthful of the soup which Luigi had brought me when the bell heralding the immediate departure of the train rang loudly. With a muttered ejaculation of annoyance, I hastily threw down on the table the price of my abandoned meal and rushed out, jumped into the train, and a moment later was speeding Londonwards, still cold and hungry and in the very worst of tempers. Of course, I promptly forgot the incident, and it was not until a year later that I was forcibly reminded of it. I had again arrived in Liverpool from New York and hurried to the same restaurant for a meal. By some queer chance, I made for a table at which Luigi was still the waiter. I should not have known him, but he recollected me and our previous meeting. With a profound bow and a smiling flash of his exquisite teeth, Luigi said quizzically, "Good evening, monsieur. Has monsieur returned for his dinner?" I looked at him in blank astonishment for a moment, then burst into a roar of laughter as I remembered both him and the long-forgotten incident of a year before. The ice was effectually broken between us, and when I left for London, I felt I had made a friend of the smiling Italian. But it was years before I discovered how deep and loyal a mutual regard had sprung out of a trifling incident. But the best friendships not infrequently owe their origin to some such triviality. Time had slipped by since then, and Luigi had climbed the ladder until the humble waiter was a power in the great cosmopolitan world of the hotel. But to me, at any rate, he was the Luigi of old. To others, he might be merely the official head of a perfectly appointed hotel, where arrangements seemed to go by clockwork, and no one ever heard of such a thing as failure. Always in a frock coat, whatever the season, whatever the hour of the day, always wearing the diamond pin given him by a travelling monarch, always alert, though never obtrusive, known to all his guests, but familiar with hardly any. Such was Luigi Bettini, and he was one of Heck's friends. I had gone to Lucerne on purpose to learn something from his lips which he would not risk in the post, and what he had told me half an hour earlier had set me thinking deeply. It entirely confirmed certain information I had been able to gain in London and Lisbon. After a long and meditative walk, I seated myself on the terrace of a café overlooking the lovely lake of Lucerne, and, with a bock before me, wrote out a telegram as follows: Arthon, Paris, returning London 14th, Casentino. Having finished my bock, I strolled along to the chief telegraph office near the station and dispatched the message. To the uninitiated, it conveyed no other meaning than appeared on the surface, but its receipt at the address for which it was destined set various elements of machinery in motion. On the evening of the 14th, there stepped from the hotel omnibus a smartly dressed young Frenchwoman, carrying a little sable Pomeranian dog and followed by a porter with her luggage. Luigi met her in the hall, and with his heels clicked together in his usual attitude of welcome, received her with an exquisite bow. She engaged a room, signed the visitor's book in the usual way, and then allowed Bettini to conduct her up by the lift. As she passed me, our eyes met, but without the slightest sign of recognition, even though the newly arrived guest was none other than my smartest assistant, Madame Gabrielle Soyer. Next day, in consequence of a note I sent her, we met in one of the sitting rooms in the further, and at the present moment unoccupied, wing of the hotel. She then told me that her own sitting room was next to one occupied by a Swedish engineer named Oscar Engström, whom I had watched in Lisbon a month before, and who was now in Switzerland engaged on some mysterious business which we had not been able to fathom. We strongly suspected, however, from various bits of evidence that had reached us, that the man was in the pay of Germany at the moment, even if he were not one of the regular German agents. When I entered, Madame Gabrielle, smartly attired in a tailor-made gown of navy blue cloth and a very bewitching hat, was standing at the window, with her pet dog beneath her arm, chatting to the immaculate Luigi, gazing the while on the blue waters of the lake. I found myself reflecting how typically French she was in every detail, dainty in face and figure, immaculately dressed, and possessing that indefinably vivacious great charm which seems to be the monopoly of the cultured Frenchwoman. She could throw it aside when she chose, such was her wonderful versatility, and assume a mask of dullness and stupidity sufficient to ensure that no one meeting her would give her a second glance. It was a valuable accomplishment, and more than once had carried her safely through a difficult and dangerous situation. Today, among friends, she was her own sunny self. "Ah, Monsieur Gérald," she cried, springing forward to greet me. "Our friend Luigi has been telling me some very strange things, eh?" "I have told Madame pretty well all I know," said the suave Italian in excellent English. "But it is not much. Engström has engaged a room for a lady friend, a Madame Bowman." "Swedish also?" I queried with a smile. "When does our friend expect Mr. Thornton, as he calls himself?" "He is expected any moment," replied Luigi. "He has retained his room ever since he left for London." "Good," I said, and we all three sat down and plunged into an intricate discussion of every detail concerning the suspects and our plan of campaign. My instructions to Luigi were to keep a constant watch upon the comings and goings of the Swedish engineer and his lady friend, while to Madame Gabriel fell the task of endeavouring to scrape acquaintance with the latter on her arrival in order to try to gain from some casual remark, for we could expect nothing more, a hint of what was in progress. Engström's lady friend, Madame Bowman, arrived in due course, and, though she was quite unaware of it, we scrutinized her closely before we gave her a chance of seeing us. I saw at once that she was a complete stranger to me. Madame Gabrielle did not know her, and Luigi, with his faultless memory for faces, declared positively that she had never entered any hotel at which he had been engaged. A new hand, in all probability, I thought, but none the less dangerous on that ground if she knows her business. Madame Bowman was a tall, handsome, fair-haired woman of decidedly distinguished appearance, and, from the scraps of her conversation which we overheard, evidently well educated and well connected. She had the blue eyes and fair hair of the typical Swede, but blue eyes and fair hair are not exactly unknown in Germany, and though there was no ostensible reason for it, I found myself wondering whether she was exactly what she professed to be. But the German spy bureau works with any tools that come handy, and, even though Madame Bowman were the pure-blooded Swede she professed to be, there was still no reason why she should not be an enemy agent as well. More than one Swedish neutral has been detected in that category and paid the penalty. Chapter 15. The real Mr. Engström. 3 days after Madame Bowman's arrival, a special messenger brought me from Heck in Paris 3 reports which, when I had read them, reduced me to a condition of blank despair. The first was from the French Consul General at Stockholm, who had been instructed to make the closest possible inquiry into the bona fides of the shipbuilding and engineering firm of Engström and Linner of Malmö. His report stated that he had paid a visit to Malmö, and as the result of his investigations there and elsewhere, he had not the least doubt that they were a first-class firm, and it was a fact of considerable interest that they were employed by the Swedish government upon several important contracts. No reason whatever could be suggested for doubting their sterling integrity, and the partners had never shown the slightest trace of pro-German bias, either as a firm or individually. This seemed a complete check to our suspicions. The second report was from Aubert, whom I had left in Lisbon. Dated from the Palace Hotel, it read, "I have kept constant observation upon the individual, Mr. Thornton, but, with the exception of the fact that he is acquainted with Halbmeier of the Königgrätzer Strasse, which, after all, may be quite innocent, I see no reason to suspect him of hostile intent. He has telegraphed several times to Lucerne, addressing his messages to the name of Seiberg at the Poste Restante. You could probably secure sight of one of these. I cannot at this end. He was visited a fortnight ago by a Swedish lady named Bowman. The latter may be a travelling agent of the enemy, but somehow, after a close vigilance, I feel doubtful. When Thornton leaves, I shall advise you. It will be best for Garcia to follow, as they have not met, and he is here for that purpose. The third report was from a certain very alert English businessman named Charles Johnson Meads, who had offices in Fenchurch Street, London. It was Johnson Meads who, by a curious statement he made to me one evening in my rooms in Curzon Street, London, had first aroused my suspicions that a deep plot, in which Engström and Thornton were somehow implicated, was on foot. Johnson Meads's report read, "I have strained every effort to learn more of these people and their mysterious movements in London. Contrary to my belief, I have now established the fact that Engström is, after all, the well-known Swedish engineer, and not the fraud I believed him to be." This, of course, appeared to be tolerably conclusive, and I was inclined to throw up the whole business at once and return to Paris, where other work urgently awaited my attention. It was clear enough from the report of the French Consul General at Stockholm that Engström and Linner would not lend their name to any shady proceedings, while Johnson Meads' apparent certainty that Engström was really what he professed to be seemed to cut away the principal basis of suspicion. Half an hour later, I met Madame Gabrielle and Luigi in the same private room and showed them the three reports, which were as disappointing to them as they were to me. Of Madame Bowman, Gabrielle had failed to discover anything which could give reasonable grounds for suspicion. According to her own statement, for the resourceful Madame Gabrielle had speedily scraped up an hotel acquaintance with her, Madame Bowman and Engström were old friends, having known each other for years in Stockholm. Moreover, it was evident that Madame Bowman at least knew Stockholm well, for Madame Gabrielle was intimately acquainted with that city, and had no difficulty, by means of apparently artless conversation, in testing the accuracy of Madame Bowman's knowledge. To all intents and purposes, we seemed to be on a wild goose chase, and I expressed this view. "There is nothing in it," was my verdict. "I think the best thing we can do is to give up wasting our time and get back to Paris at once. You know there is the Morny affair waiting for me, and Heck is anxious I should take it in hand without delay." The Morny affair was one of those queer financial scandals which have been so rife in Paris during the war. A Frenchman, hitherto of unblemished reputation as a patriot, had suddenly come under suspicion of trafficking with the enemy. Questions and rumours had been flying thickly in the Paris press, as well as in the Chamber, and it was urgently important that the unfortunate Mr. Morny, for I, at least, believed he was being slandered by a group of business rivals and political enemies, should be cleared once and for all of suspicions which were rapidly reducing him to a state of complete prostration. How, later, I succeeded in completely vindicating his character, I hope to tell at some future time. At present, a full disclosure of the facts might do untold harm. But Madame Gabrielle, her feminine intuition busily at work, was not to be easily put off. She strongly dissented from my view. "Yesterday," she said, "during Madame Bowman's absence with Engström at Brunner, I took Luigi's master key, and entering her room, opened her dressing case and thoroughly searched her papers. It is true, I found nothing of interest, save that there were letters from certain friends in London, the addresses of which I have copied. And I found this." This was a blank sheet of notepaper which she produced, bearing the heading of the Palace Hotel at Lisbon. "You see," she said, "it has been very carefully preserved, for it was enclosed in these two envelopes. I wonder why." I took the blank paper from her and examined it carefully. I found it to be the ordinary hotel notepaper, exactly similar to that which I myself had used in the hotel writing room during my recent visit to the Portuguese capital. "Well," I said, "I don't see how that proves or even suggests anything. We know perfectly well that Madame Bowman has been to Lisbon. She herself makes no secret whatever of the fact, and she may very well have brought away by accident a sheet of the hotel notepaper and a couple of envelopes. It is true she seems friendly with both men, and there is undoubtedly some suspicion. But is it sufficient to justify action on our part, or even to give us good reason for staying here and devoting to a very trivial matter valuable time, which at the moment we might be spending to much greater advantage in Paris?" Luigi raised his dark eyebrows and shrugged his shoulders. It was obvious that he was entirely of my way of thinking, and, though he was willing to do anything to help me and to put a spoke in the wheel of the Hun plotters, for like all patriotic Italians, he cherished the liveliest hatred for the Austro-Germans, he was no fonder than I am myself of the profitless task of chasing a will-o'-the-wisp. But the merry, go-ahead little Frenchwoman had her suspicions very thoroughly aroused, and I knew well that when this was the case, it was not an easy task to allay them. "I do not care, mon cher Gerald. There is evil work in progress somewhere, I am confident. Why should Thornton be acquainted or have anything to do with our arch-enemy, Ernst Halbmeier? Remember how cleverly he escaped you 6 months ago in Rotterdam." "But we trapped the woman," I rejoined grimly, "and there was a firing party at Versailles." "And there is somebody to be trapped here also," persisted Madame Gabrielle. "You will surely not give up yet." While we were still discussing the matter, a page boy brought a telegram. Luigi took it from the lad and, dismissing him, handed the message to me. It was from Aubert in Lisbon, and it conveyed the significant news that this man Thornton had left for Lucerne, and that Garcia was travelling by the same train. "He has just sent a telegram to Syberg at the Poste Restante," the message concluded. After this, of course, there could be no question of our abandoning our task. There was evidently something afoot, and just as evidently, Lucerne was likely to be the scene of some lively incidents. Luigi did not lose a second. He rang the bell, and immediately another page boy appeared. "Go at once to the Poste Restante," he said, "and ask for a telegram for Syberg. They know you come from me, so there will be no need of a letter. Don't forget the name, Syberg, and make haste." The boy disappeared instantly, and for a quarter of an hour we waited in feverish impatience for his return. When he came back, he brought with him the message we wanted. Opening it, I read in French as follows: "To Syberg, Poste Restante, Lucerne. Received good news from London. Meads," the man in London whose suspicions had been aroused, "is now with us, so business can proceed, leaving for Lucerne tonight. Shall see tea in Paris to arrange further details and transit of machinery. Thyra, the Christian name of Madame Bowman, will meet E.H. was this Ernst Halbmeier, at Geneva on the 15th. This message was unsigned, but it confirmed the impression given us by Aubert's wire that events were on foot, and at once the three of us plunged with renewed energy into our plan of campaign. "There can be no doubt," I said, "that E.H. refers to Halbmeier, and probably he is directing the whole of the intricate affair." "Very likely," said Luigi dryly, "but I do not see that we have much more light on what direction against the British the conspirators, if they really are German agents, intend to work." "True, but that is just what we have to find out," I replied. "From what Johnson Meade states, the plot in some way relates to the British submarines. At present, I am just as much in the dark as you are. If Halbmeier is directing operations, you may depend upon it that some really serious coup is intended, for Halbmeier never troubles his head about the small affairs. Don't forget that next to Steinhauer, he is the man the Königgrätzer Strasse puts most implicit faith in." Events were now moving rapidly. I waited with anxiety for the arrival of the man Thornton, whom I had never seen, for I was particularly anxious to have a look at him. I suspected very strongly that he was one of the German Secret Service men masquerading under an assumed name, and I was therefore particularly anxious for an opportunity of identifying him. I argued with myself that if he was mixed up with anything big enough to call for the cooperation of Halbmeier, he must be one of the big men himself, and it was quite possible I might be able to identify him, for personally or through photographs I was well acquainted with most of the leaders of German espionage work. Thornton at length reached the Waldesruhe, where he was greeted by the urbane Luigi with all the evidence of distinguished consideration which made the suave Italian so popular with his many patrons. Thornton would have passed for an Englishman anywhere, both in looks and language. He was perfectly dressed in clothes unmistakably British in cut, and spoke the language to perfection. This, however, was hardly surprising, for as we learned afterwards, he had lived in London ever since he was 14. He had, however, been brought up in circles which were virulently anti-British, and had absorbed to the fullest extent that poisonous hatred of everything English which so frequently displays itself in the Hun who has made England his home of convenience. He little suspected that the smiling Luigi, who so assiduously attended to his comforts, was one of the secret agents of the Allies, that another, in the person of myself, saw his arrival, or that in the turret of the great hotel there was a small secret room containing a powerful wireless set, which I sometimes operated myself. I had to be very careful not to be seen by Thornton, for it was quite possible, if my suspicions were well founded, that he might know me. And it was well that I did, for I recognized him instantly as Emil Brahe, a German agent of whom we had lost sight for some time. He had formerly been engaged on the continent and was well known to our men, though of late years he seemed to have dropped out of active work, and we had lost sight of him altogether. I realized now that we had been cleverly tricked. We had believed him to belong to the Berlin branch, while all the time he was living quietly in England, where he did no business whatever, and was thus never suspected even by the astute men of the special branch. We had relied much on Madame Gabrielle's powers to extract information from Madame Beaumane, with whom she was already on excellent terms. The pair often sat chatting in the lounge, smoking each other's cigarettes, and I knew the fair Gabrielle was keenly on the alert for any slip by which Madame Beaumane might give herself away. The Swedish woman, however, was far too clever and would betray nothing. Shadowing Thornton, or Brahe, to give him his right name, was Manuel Garcia, a capable ex-detective of the Lisbon police, who was now an agent of the Central Bureau of Counter-Espionage in Paris. That telegrams were constantly passing between the Swedish engineer and some people in Lyons and Marseille I knew, and indeed I was able to secure copies of some of them. In this way, I discovered that these Swedes were on very friendly terms with a banker named Herteau, who had carried on business in Paris before the war, had afterwards escaped to Zurich, and had long been suspected of being one of the paymasters of the spy bureau in Berlin. On the morning of the 13th, in consequence of what Madame Gabrielle had told me, I took train to Geneva, where I put up at the National. Manuel Garcia followed by the next train, and early next morning I received a telephone message from Madame Gabrielle telling me that Madame Beaumane had left the Waldesrue and was due at Geneva at 4 o'clock that afternoon. As a result of this message, Garcia and I watched the incoming train, and my assistant followed Madame Beaumane in a taxi to a small hotel in the Quai de Mont Blanc. An hour later, Garcia himself took a cab to the hotel so as to watch for the arrival of Halbmeier, the real antagonist with whom our duel was being fought out. Halbmeier, a short, stout, bald-headed man, with perfect manners and the air of a bon viveur, kept his appointment punctually, arriving from Bâle the next day about noon. As he knew me well, I was compelled to remain in hiding, but from my window I was able, with a pair of good field glasses, to watch Madame Beaumane and the German walking together on the Promenade du Lac, evidently engaged in the closest conversation. Garcia, of course, was not far away. The pair remained together for an hour and a half, and I noticed with amusement that the wily Halbmeier took particular care to select a seat which stood quite in the open, with no shelter of any kind at hand behind which an eavesdropper might lurk. Garcia was thus, of course, effectually kept at a distance, and had no opportunity of gleaning anything from our enemy's conversation. Apparently, the two, in the course of their earnest conversation, arrived at some definite agreement, for when they at length rose and parted, Halbmeier returned direct to the station, where he had left his luggage in the cloakroom, while the Swedish woman went back to her hotel, leaving for Lucerne an hour later. By the next train, I also travelled with Garcia to Lucerne. Immediately on our arrival, we all had a consultation, and we were deep in talk when I received a startling message from Heck in Paris. It had been sent to him by Johnson Meads, who had promised to communicate with me through Heck if any further suspicious matter came under his notice. The message read, "Cancel my last message. Most urgent, I should see you immediately." Now Johnson Meads' last message had reported him as being assured of the bona fides of Engström. The cancellation of that could only mean one thing, that the Engström we knew was a fraud, and that for some sinister purpose he was trading on the good name of a perfectly reputable firm of engineers in Sweden. An hour later, I was on my way to London. I arrived there without incident, and for an hour sat with Mr. Johnson Meads in his office in Fenchurch Street. "I am afraid you will think me criminally careless, Mr. Sant," he said, "in the matter of my assurance that the man you know as Engström was what he professed to be. But I was deceived by a curious coincidence, and can only offer as an excuse that I have not had your training in solving problems of this kind. You will remember what I told you when I met you in Curzon Street. Well, that remains true. Where I went wrong was in identifying Engström with the head of the Swedish firm. It so happened that I have business friends in Malmö, and, after our conversation, being still very suspicious, I wrote to them asking for information about Engström and Linna. I soon received a reply, which was in every way satisfactory, and my correspondent mentioned, quite casually, that Mr. Engström was actually in London and was staying at the Hotel Cecil. As I had that very day seen the man we now know as Engström, that seemed to me to clinch the matter, and perhaps foolishly, I dropped all suspicion. Now for the curious coincidence. A few days ago I was going home by train about 6 o'clock. The trains, of course, were packed, and I was strap-hanging. We had just left King's Cross when, owing to steam in the tunnel, our train ran with considerable violence into a train which was standing in the tunnel. The smash was not serious, but the shock was severe, and I was thrown right on top of a gentleman sitting on a seat close by me. A metal dispatch case he was carrying caught my face and, as you will see, cut it very badly. I was stunned for a moment, and when I came round, I found the stranger holding me up. He tied a handkerchief round my face and very kindly helped me out of the train to a hotel where he got me some brandy, and I soon recovered. He had to go on, and as we were about to part, he handed me his card. I slipped it into my pocket without looking at it, and went home very much shaken. It was not until 2 days later that I looked at it. It read, Engström and Linna, Stockholm, Oscar Engström. "Now, Mr. Sant," he went on, "the Mr. Engström who helped me was not the man we both know as Engström. He did not resemble him in the slightest degree. I immediately tried to find Mr. Engström, but found to my dismay that he had left the Hotel Cecil, and no one knew where he had gone. He was on a holiday tour, and when he tears a few days from business, he frequently disappears altogether for a week in order to get a complete rest from business cares. I have wired Malmö, and all they can tell me is that he will not be back for 10 days. Now what can we do?" I thought deeply for a few moments. Obviously, I must see the real Mr. Engström as soon as possible, but there was no chance of finding him immediately, and in the meantime, much might happen. I soon made up my mind. "I shall return to Lucerne at once," I said, "and go from there to Stockholm in time to meet Mr. Engström on his arrival. There is nothing else to be done." 2 days later, I was back in Lucerne. Engström, his friend Thornton, and Madame Bowman were still there, busy on their plot, whatever it was, and entirely unsuspicious either of the urbane hotel manager or the pretty little Frenchwoman who had apparently developed a lively affection for the handsome Swedish woman. One day I learned from Luigi that, in the course of a couple of hours, Engström had received 3 telegrams and had sent a reply to each of them. Of their purport, Luigi could gain no knowledge. Now, I was particularly anxious to get a sight of those telegrams, for obviously they might throw a good deal of light on the business on which Engström was engaged. I laid my plans accordingly. That same afternoon, with Luigi's assistance, I managed to transform myself into a passable imitation of a very unkempt and dirty mechanic, and as soon as the Swedish engineer left the hotel, about 5:30, it was his usual habit to go out to take an aperitif. I took Luigi's master key, which unlocked all the doors in the hotel, and crept noiselessly to Engström's room. I was soon inside, and a few minutes later, with the aid of my own skeleton keys, had opened the big leather travelling trunk and was hastily examining its contents. A number of telegrams had been hastily thrust into the trunk. I had grasped my prize and was just about to shut and relock the trunk when I heard a sound behind me, and, turning, found myself face to face with Oscar Engström himself. And not only that, but I was looking straight into the barrel of a very serviceable-looking automatic pistol, held without a tremor in Engström's very capable hands.